It's time for a little confession. Welcome, I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you for joining me. I don't know about you, but I have really struggled in my life with being what would be called a pessimist. My husband used to call me a pessimist a lot. The reality is that I was definitely a pessimist. I could also argue a realist, but I was definitely a pessimist. And it can sometimes easily creep back in. And it happens typically in times when I'm feeling a little bit more vulnerable. Maybe it's just something really mild or something a little bit more significant. But that pessimism can creep back in pretty easily. And I've found myself kind of over the last year or so feeling a little bit more of that than what is typical for me. Because with healing, fortunately, instead of mostly being a pessimist, I would say that I have shifted to being more of an optimist, still a realist, but recognizing that even with realism, there can also be optimism. So for me, oftentimes that pessimism was certainly like the glass being half empty instead of half full, because eventually it would be empty and then you needed to be able to fill it. And what were you going to do? And you can't wait till the glass is actually empty before you figure out what you're going to do, because then it's too late. Right? And I know there are some of you who can absolutely relate to that. And so no matter what it was that I would be thinking about, there was a lot of pessimism because I was trying to prepare for the inevitable negative outcome and trying to be prepared for making sure that everything was going to be okay. And like I said, fortunately with healing, it's really never that extreme anymore, thankfully. But it can definitely creep in. And when there is a lot going on, either in my world or in the community, in the world in general, it's much easier to feel into that because we have less control over things that are happening externally. And so today I wanted to take a little bit of time to help all of us, hopefully, just be a really specific, intentional time to connect with something that maybe feels a little bit better, in case you've been having some difficulty feeling a little bit more of the fear, the pessimism, the lack of control, or feeling powerless in the world. Because I know I'm not alone. And if you're not in that group, then you definitely don't need to watch this, but it might be something you want to save in case you find yourself getting into that place where you're feeling a little maybe overwhelmed or just frustrated or defeated, whatever the case might be. So this is really something that is pretty simple, or the practice of it can be a little bit more challenging, but the idea is certainly pretty simple. And really, the more you incorporate it, the more beneficial it becomes. So this can look different ways. It doesn't have to look any particular way, but it's about giving yourself the space to reflect on things that you have been able to experience, that you have been able to create, that feels good to you in some way. And I know that this can be challenging because there might be something that you could feel good about, but maybe it didn't ultimately result in what you wanted it to result in. So therefore you ignore it, you dismiss it, and act as if it wasn't a good thing at all, that it was actually bad because maybe you wasted your time or you had false hope or whatever it is that you say to yourself. But it is important that we look at these things, even if they don't turn out the way that we ultimately hope that they will, because we don't have control over the outcome of a lot of things in our lives. What we do have control over for the most part, is the choices that we make to help us do or create the thing that we want. And so, and I would encourage you to really give yourself some space by like carving out a little bit of time. Maybe you even begin to incorporate this into a regular routine. Journal, ideally, because journaling can really help you get to things that are easily overlooked. It can help you reconnect to feelings a little bit more because you're giving yourself more time with the ideas that come to mind. But reflect on what is something, just identify one thing for now. What is something that you can reflect on that you might feel surprised by? That something that you did, something that you tried, so it doesn't have to be that you were successful, whatever that might look like to you, something you tried, something you'd been wanting to do for a while, or maybe it came up all of a sudden and you took a risk and you tried it. Even if it didn't turn out the way that you ultimately thought it might or hoped that it would. A risk that you took, generally, and it could be in a lot of different ways, that again, even if it didn't ultimately turn out the way that you wanted to, it took a lot within you to be able to take that risk. Maybe reflecting on a situation or an experience of something that made you laugh, something that surprised you about yourself. Maybe it's something that you did, something you accomplished, something that you thought about in a way that was different than maybe when you were more pessimistic in how you might think about it. There really could be hundreds of different things that you come up with, and I feel confident in saying that. I think for each and every one of you, hundreds, if not thousands of things, depending on your age, that you can reflect on and come up with that could bring some of this for you. Things that are very real for you in your life. I know it may not seem like it. I know it can be hard to identify and connect with it, but I really do feel pretty confident in being able to say that for every single one of you. And when we give ourselves the time and the space to reflect on those things, to see something about ourselves, about our lives, that's a little bit different than our normal way of thinking, it really can help shift us out of the place of fear, the place of powerlessness, ultimately the pessimism that we might tend to experience. And I think for a lot of people, we don't necessarily identify it as pessimism. And I would not have identified it as pessimism for sure. Like I said, I was a realist. The truth is, I was afraid of not having enough. I was afraid of something bad happening. I was afraid of what would happen to me if I didn't resolve the problem. There was a lot that was going on there, and much of that was around fear. And I think for most people who are somewhat pessimistic, a lot of that comes from fear. And part of how we move out of fear, because fear becomes kind of our default, even if we're not consciously thinking, I'm afraid, blank. Our nervous system is living from that place of uncertainty, unease, fear. And the fear could be a lot of different things. It can look a lot of different ways. It can even feel a lot of different ways. Sometimes fear feels like anger. Sometimes fear feels like powerlessness or hopelessness. Sometimes fear feels like panic. Sometimes it can feel like apathy. So there's a lot of different ways that fear can show up without us being aware that we're afraid. When you make intentional effort to connect to yourself, to things that you can feel good about, to identifying small incremental changes that you've been able to create for yourself, Maybe it is practicing this when normally you might not. Maybe it is something like making sure that you're getting enough hydration. It could be taking a few more reasonable risks. It could be practicing connecting more often. It could be trying something new. There are so many different things. And when you are intentional about recognizing those things for yourself, your body, your heart, your nervous system get to experience the reality of something different. So not just an idea, right? We're experiencing the lived thing that we've just done, or the thing that we did 10 years ago, but we're reconnecting to the reality of an experience that helps us see, to ultimately trust that we have that capacity, that we have within us the ability to connect, to take risks, to try something new, to enjoy something we never even allowed ourselves to consider we might do. There are truly so many things that I couldn't even begin to mention them all, of the possibilities of what this could look like for you in your life. But taking time. So what I would ultimately encourage people to do, you know that I am a huge proponent of journaling, but in your journal, and maybe it's a separate sort of entry, maybe it's even a separate little journal, but I would really encourage you to, if you can, maybe every day, or maybe just 2 to 3 times a week, sit down and write some of those things for you. So again, things that maybe you feel good about, even if, like, it doesn't have to have a particular outcome for you to feel good about it. And I know that that's hard to wrap your head around sometimes, because so many of us are perfectionists, and that can keep us from trying new things. But if it doesn't turn out exactly like we wanted it to, we see it as a failure. And instead of being able to feel good about the fact that we tried it, or even good about the fact that it actually turned out well, even if it wasn't exactly how we expected, we have difficulty seeing that as a positive. We automatically just believe that because it didn't meet some certain expectation or standard, that somehow it's a failure. So many different things. There are so many, I promise you, there are so many things that you can look at. It might be something really, really small, or seemingly small, actually. I would imagine that it's probably not really small. And often in life, and certainly on this journey, sometimes the seemingly really small things over time make the most difference. So it's important to keep that in mind too. So maybe you went to bed a little bit earlier one night. Maybe the rest of the week you didn't, but one night you went to bed earlier. That's one more night than what you had done previously, right? Maybe you reach out to somebody and just say, hi, how are you doing? Or something like that. Maybe there's a lot going on with you that you would like to be able to talk to somebody about, but you feel like you can't for whatever reason, but you still reach out to somebody and say, hi, how you doing? Or maybe you respond to somebody who has reached out to you. And you may see that as not a big deal, that it didn't really mean anything because it didn't really shift anything for you or whatever. But if that took conscious awareness and effort for you to do that, then that is something to feel good about. And of course, there are lots of big things potentially that might be happening too, but those are a little bit easier to identify. But really small things, like if, for example, you have difficulty sleeping and you have a night that is a little bit better than other nights, then that is something to acknowledge. Now, obviously, you probably didn't do anything to make that happen, or maybe you did. Maybe you were very intentional about your routine before you went to bed. And if so, then there's a whole lot there to be able to take in. But even just taking a moment to acknowledge, oh, last night was a little bit better. So it doesn't, in this context, for this purpose, it doesn't matter if the previous month has been horrible. Acknowledging this one night is important. And I'm saying it very specifically about for this context, because of course it matters that you're not sleeping well. And that's important to be able to address and all of that. But for the purpose of this, and so this is how I want you to think about it, right? Because it's natural to go to, well, but it was one night and the 10 nights since then have sucked too. It is natural for our mind to go there. And that's why this is a very intentional practice to think about the one time that it didn't. And the more that you're able to connect to the reality of these times, these experiences, the more real they become. Because when we live in that place of fear, pessimism, believing that we're failing, believing that we'll never get to where we want to be, when we live from that place, anything that can prove the possibility of something different, we completely ignore. If it registers in any capacity, we make excuses for it. I got lucky, or well, that was just one time, it doesn't really matter, or it didn't turn out how I hoped, so therefore it doesn't matter, right? It's very natural for us to go to that place. And the more vulnerable we're feeling generally, so a lack of sleep creates vulnerability, just regular everyday stress creates vulnerability, not feeling well creates vulnerability. So any vulnerability that we have makes it more likely and easier, frankly, that we're going to go to those places of it doesn't matter because, whatever that because is. So try it. If you are on a healing journey, on an emotional wellness journey, try it. 3 days, 5 days, a week. Give yourself some time. And if you don't do it consecutively, that's okay. You don't have to do it every day. If you don't, this is where people can get hung up too. Okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do it every day. And then you miss a day and you give up on it because, see, I can't do it. I can't stick to anything. This isn't going to work. And I know that because I've been there too. Not to mention all the people that have shared with me similar kinds of thoughts. But it's okay. Every day is a new chance to do it again. And it doesn't have to be consecutive. I do think you'll get more from it. If you're able to do this on a regular basis, you will see a shift happen more quickly. But for a lot of people, for a number of reasons, just doing it once and then maybe a couple weeks later thinking about it and doing it again, that is the start of a practice. You have to start somewhere, right? And there's no wrong place to start. But this is a really powerful thing to do. And you're not going to notice significant changes in the moment. You might be able to feel a connection to feeling good about something or proud of yourself, or you might smile about something. It might cause you to look forward to something else. You might have that, but depending on where you are on this journey, you might have some other thoughts quickly creep in to kind of keep you from being able to feel too much of that because it's trying to protect you. And that's a big part of the reason why the practice, being intentional about doing it as regularly as you can, is important. Because when those thoughts come in and then you don't do it anymore, because those thoughts obviously aren't going to feel good, right? So then you don't do it. In a sense, those thoughts win. Those thoughts then get to say, see, it really didn't mean anything. When you are doing it a little bit more consistently, you don't have as much kind of space in your head for those, because you're, instead of just having a head filled with all of those thoughts, you're taking up a little bit of that space with some more positive, more realistic, more life affirming, more compassionate thoughts and realities. Because your head is, you can only hold so many thoughts, right? And I don't know, I'm just saying that. But truly, you only have so much space, right? And so if you're bringing in some of the more realistic, compassionate sorts of things, then you're pushing out some of those other things. And the more you do that, the more your head gets filled with the reality of what is possible for you. I'd love to hear from you. What came up? Be honest, did you roll your eyes? Did you think, I've tried that before and it doesn't work? That may be a reality. Did you give up because it didn't work? And that's where people can get caught up a lot. It takes time for it to ultimately begin to really work. Just like, unfortunately, most everything on this journey, it takes time before you're able to do the thing. It takes time before you're able to trust in the thing. It takes time of you doing things a little differently before you see that you're doing things differently. That is, unfortunately, the reality of this process. So I would love to hear from you. What came up for you as I was talking about it? And if you try it, or maybe you've done it already, I would love for you to share what came up for you. How was it for you? You might inspire somebody else to give it a try. So thanks so much for being here, and I will look forward to seeing you next time.